Alexander Sterling had built his technology empire from nothing, transforming a small software startup in his garage into one of Britain's most valuable companies within 15 years. At 42, he was worth over £2 billion and commanded respect in boardrooms across London. His company, Sterling Tech Solutions, employed over 50,000 people worldwide and had contracts with governments, corporations, and even members of the royal family for their personal security systems. The success had come at a tremendous personal cost. Alexander worked 18-hour days, rarely took vacations, and had been through 2 divorces because he prioritized business over relationships. His current wife, Victoria, was a former model 20 years his junior who seemed more interested in his wealth than his company. They lived in a massive estate in Surrey worth £30 million, complete with staff quarters, a helicopter pad, and enough luxury cars to stock a dealership. Alexander's personality had become increasingly demanding and controlling over the years. Employees walked on eggshells around him, knowing that his temper could flare without warning over the smallest perceived inefficiency or mistake. He had fired dozens of executives for what others might consider minor errors, earning him a reputation as a brilliant but ruthless leader who tolerated no opposition to his vision. The morning that would change his life forever began like any other, with Alexander reviewing quarterly report in his executive office on the top floor of the Sterling Tower in Canary Wharf. His assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 8 years and knew his moods better than anyone. She could tell he was particularly stressed because of the upcoming board meeting where several investors were questioning his latest acquisition strategy. Sterling Tech had recently purchased 3 smaller companies for a combined total of £800 million, decisions Alexander had made unilaterally without consulting the board. While his track record of successful acquisitions was impressive, some board members were becoming concerned about his increasingly autocratic leadership style and the financial risks he was taking without proper oversight. At 11:30, Margaret informed Alexander that his appointment at Buckingham Palace had been confirmed for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Sterling Tech had been selected to upgrade the palace's entire digital security infrastructure, a prestigious contract worth £50 million over 3 years. The meeting was to finalize the technical specifications and discuss the implementation timeline with palace officials and security personnel. Alexander had been looking forward to this meeting for weeks, not just for the business opportunity but for the prestige it represented. Having the royal family as clients would elevate his company's status and open doors to other high-profile government contracts. He had personally overseen every aspect of the proposal, ensuring it was flawless and comprehensive. The drive to Buckingham Palace took 45 minutes through London traffic, giving Alexander time to review his presentation materials and prepare for what he expected to be a routine business meeting. His chauffeur, James, navigated the Bentley through the busy streets while Alexander made phone calls to various executives, his voice sharp and demanding as he issued instructions and criticized performance metrics. Upon arriving at the palace gates, Alexander experienced his first moment of frustration. The security checkpoint process was more thorough than he had anticipated, requiring multiple forms of identification, background verification, and a detailed inspection of his briefcase and electronic devices. As a man accustomed to being waved through VIP entrances and fast-tracked through airports, the standard security protocols struck him as unnecessarily bureaucratic. The Royal Guard conducting the security check was Sergeant David Mitchell, a 28-year-old career soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the elite unit responsible for protecting the royal family. David approached his duties with military precision and took pride in maintaining the highest security standards, regardless of a visitor's wealth or status. Alexander's impatience became evident as the security process stretched beyond what he considered reasonable. He glanced at his expensive Rolex repeatedly and made comments about the inefficiency of the procedures, suggesting that someone of his stature shouldn't be subjected to such extensive screening. David remained professionally courteous but thorough, explaining that security protocols applied equally to all visitors without exception. The tension escalated when David discovered that one of Alexander's electronic devices hadn't been properly cleared through the preliminary security assessment. The device, a prototype tablet containing sensitive Sterling Tech intellectual property, would need additional screening before Alexander could bring it into the palace. This would delay the entry process by at least another 20 minutes. Alexander's reaction was swift and characteristic of his personality. He demanded to speak to David's supervisor, insisting that the delay was unacceptable and that he had an important meeting that couldn't be postponed. When David politely explained that security protocols couldn't be circumvented regardless of the visitor's schedule or status, Alexander's frustration boiled over into anger. The confrontation attracted the attention of other security personnel and palace staff, who watched as the wealthy businessman began raising his voice at the royal guard. Alexander accused David of being deliberately obstructive and suggested that the guard was enjoying the power to inconvenience someone successful. His language became increasingly inappropriate, with personal attacks on David's intelligence and competence. David maintained his professional demeanor throughout, Alexander's tirade, responding with military courtesy and patience that seemed to infuriate the businessman even more. The guard's calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to Alexander's escalating rage, making the scene even more uncomfortable. For the growing number of witnesses, the breaking point came when Alexander demanded that David's commanding officer be summoned immediately to override the security protocols. When David explained that he couldn't abandon his post or bypass established procedures, Alexander stepped closer and began pointing his finger aggressively at the guard's chest while continuing his verbal assault. Other palace staff and security personnel began moving closer to the scene, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond a normal visitor complaint. Alexander's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and potentially threatening, though David continued to handle the situation with remarkable restraint and professionalism. The businessman's sense of entitlement and frustration with being treated like an ordinary citizen rather than a VIP was driving his anger to dangerous levels. In his mind, his wealth and business success should exempt him from the standard rules that applied to regular visitors. The fact that a young soldier was enforcing protocols that inconvenienced him felt like a personal affront to his status and importance. Victoria, Alexander's wife, had accompanied him to the palace and was watching the confrontation with growing embarrassment and alarm. She tried several times to calm her husband down, reminding him that they were at Buckingham Palace and that his behavior was inappropriate and potentially damaging to his business reputation. Alexander ignored his wife's attempts at intervention, becoming more aggressive and demanding with each passing minute. His face was flushed with anger, and his voice had risen to a level that was attracting attention from tourists and passers-by outside the palace gates. The scene was becoming a public spectacle, with several people beginning to record the incident on their mobile phones. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the observers. A man who had built his fortune on security technology was now creating a security incident at one of the world's most protected buildings. Alexander's expertise in digital security systems had made him wealthy, but his inability to control his temper was about to cost him everything he had worked to build. As the confrontation continued to escalate, neither Alexander nor David could have predicted how dramatically the next few minutes would change both of their lives forever. The wealthy businessman's sense of superiority and the royal guard's unwavering commitment to duty were on a collision course that would have consequences neither man could imagine. The morning after Alexander Sterling's arrest brought devastating news that would accelerate his downfall beyond anything he could have imagined. While he sat in his cell awaiting bail proceedings, the Metropolitan Police had obtained warrants to search both his home and Sterling Tech offices as part of what they claimed was a routine investigation into his background and character for the assault charges. What the police discovered during these searches would transform a simple assault case into something far more serious. Detective Inspector Crawford's team found evidence of massive tax evasion, fraudulent business practices, and illegal surveillance activities that Sterling Tech had been conducting on behalf of private clients. The company that had built its reputation on legitimate security services had been operating a shadow business involving corporate espionage and privacy violations. The evidence included encrypted files detailing how Sterling Tech had illegally accessed competitor databases, intercepted private communications for wealthy clients going through divorce proceedings, and even conducted unauthorized surveillance on government officials. Alexander had been so confident in his ability to operate above the law that he had kept detailed records of these illegal activities, apparently viewing them as trophies of his business acumen. The Financial Conduct Authority was notified immediately and began their own investigation into Sterling Tech's business practices. Within hours of receiving the police evidence, they froze all company accounts pending a full audit of the firm's finances. This action effectively shut down Sterling Tech operations worldwide, leaving 50,000 employees uncertain about their jobs and their futures. The tax evasion charges were particularly damaging because they revealed the extent to which Alexander had been hiding income and assets from His Majesty's revenue and customs through a complex network of offshore accounts and shell companies. He had avoided paying an estimated £200 million in taxes over the past 5 years. The sophisticated nature of the scheme suggested it had been carefully planned and executed over many years. Victoria Sterling faced her own nightmare as investigators seized assets throughout their Surrey estate. Luxury cars, artwork, jewelry, and other valuable items were catalogued and marked for potential seizure as proceeds of criminal activity. The woman who had married Alexander for his wealth watched helplessly as armed investigators systematically dismantled the lavish lifestyle she had taken for granted. The media coverage intensified dramatically as the scope of Alexander's alleged crimes became public. What had started as a story about a businessman losing his temper had evolved into a major scandal involving corporate corruption, tax evasion, and abuse of power. News outlets competed to uncover additional details about Sterling Tech's illegal activities and Alexander's hidden criminal empire. Sterling Tech's stock price collapsed completely, falling by 97% in 2 days of trading before being suspended by the London Stock Exchange. Institutional investors who had trusted Alexander's leadership lost billions of pounds, while pension funds and individual shareholders saw their investments become essentially worthless overnight. The company that had been worth £12 billion was now facing bankruptcy and dissolution. The board of directors held another emergency meeting and unanimously voted to remove Alexander as CEO and chairman, appointing an interim leadership team to try to salvage what remained of the legitimate parts of the business. However, the damage to Sterling Tech's reputation was so severe that major clients were already terminating contracts and demanding refunds for services not yet delivered. Alexander's legal situation deteriorated rapidly as prosecutors added charges of tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to the original assault charge. His bail was denied due to flight risk concerns, given his substantial offshore assets and the serious nature of the charges. The man who had controlled a business empire worth billions was now confined to a small cell. While his world collapsed around him, the investigation revealed that Alexander's illegal activities had international implications. Sterling Tech had been conducting unauthorized surveillance operations in multiple countries, potentially violating laws in the United States, European Union, and other jurisdictions. Interpol issued alerts regarding the investigation, and several countries began their own proceedings to determine whether Alexander had committed crimes within their territories. David Mitchell, the royal guard who had been assaulted, found himself at the center of a much larger story than anyone had anticipated. While he had initially been seen simply as the victim of an angry businessman's outburst, he was now being praised as the catalyst who had brought down a major criminal enterprise. His steadfast professionalism during the confrontation had led to the investigation that exposed Alexander's crimes. The impact on Alexander's family members was devastating and far-reaching. His daughter Emma at Oxford faced constant media attention and harassment from reporters trying to get comments about her father's alleged crimes. The prestigious university was considering whether the scandal might affect her ability to continue her studies, given the intense public scrutiny and security concerns. Marcus, Alexander's 16-year-old son, was withdrawn from his expensive private school by his mother when classmates and their families began treating him as a pariah. The teenager struggled to understand how his successful father had become a national villain overnight, and the psychological impact of the sudden social isolation was severe. Victoria Sterling's life had become a nightmare of legal proceedings, media harassment, and financial uncertainty. The woman who had been accustomed to shopping at exclusive boutiques and dining at the finest restaurants was now accompanied everywhere by lawyers and investigators. Her access to the family's assets had been frozen, leaving her dependent on legal aid and the charity of friends. The employees of Sterling Tech faced their own crisis as the company's operations ground to a halt. Many had invested their life savings in company stock and pension schemes that were now worthless. Highly skilled engineers, programmers, and security professionals found themselves unemployed and potentially unemployable due to their association with a company now synonymous with criminal activity. Investigation expanded to examine Alexander's relationships with government officials and other prominent business people. Several politicians who had accepted campaign contributions from Sterling Tech faced questions about whether they had knowledge of the company's illegal activities. The scandal was threatening to expose a broader network of corruption and influence peddling. International clients of Sterling Tech began their own investigations to determine what information the company might have obtained about their operations through illegal surveillance. Several major corporations filed lawsuits seeking damages for privacy violations and corporate espionage, adding civil liability to Alexander's already overwhelming legal problems. The Royal Security Service conducted an internal review to determine whether Sterling Tech's proposed work on palace security systems could have compromised royal family safety. The possibility that a criminal organization had nearly gained access to the most sensitive security installations in the country raised serious questions about government contracting procedures and background check protocols. Alexander's former business associates began distancing themselves from him as quickly as possible. Board members of other companies where Alexander served resigned their positions. Charity organizations returned his donations, and social clubs revoked his memberships. The wealthy businessman who had once been sought after for his expertise and connections became a social and professional pariah overnight. The psychological impact of his rapid fall from grace was evident during Alexander's court appearances. The confident, commanding presence that had intimidated business rivals and employees had been replaced by a hollow, defeated demeanor. Prison life and the constant stress of facing multiple serious criminal charges had taken a visible toll on his physical and mental health. As the investigation continued to uncover new evidence of criminal activity, it became clear that Alexander's assault on the Royal Guard had been the catalyst for exposing one of the largest corporate crime schemes in British history. The man who had built his fortune through illegal activities had ultimately been brought down by his own inability to control his temper in a moment of frustration. The irony wasn't lost on observers that Alexander Sterling, who had made his fortune in security technology, had been undone by the very security protocols he had tried to bypass. His moment of rage at being treated like an ordinary citizen had triggered the investigation that revealed he had been living as a criminal for years. The investigation was far from over, and new revelations about the scope of Alexander's criminal activities emerged daily. What had begun as a simple assault case had evolved into a complex international investigation that would take years to fully resolve. The Royal Guard's professional response to being slapped had inadvertently triggered the collapse of one of Britain's largest criminal enterprises. 3 weeks after Alexander Sterling's arrest, the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The Metropolitan Police had established a dedicated task force with over 40 detectives working around the clock to unravel the complex web of criminal activities that Sterling Tech had been conducting for years. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of British society. The breakthrough came when investigators cracked the encryption on Alexander's personal computer servers, revealing communications that implicated dozens of prominent individuals in the illegal surveillance scheme. The files contained recordings of private phone calls, photographs taken without consent, and detailed reports on the personal lives of politicians, business rivals, celebrities, and even members of the judiciary. Among the most shocking discoveries was evidence that Sterling Tech had been blackmailing several high-profile individuals using illegally obtained information about their private affairs. A cabinet minister had been paying Alexander £50,000 per month to prevent the release of compromising photographs. A prominent judge had been influenced in several court cases involving Alexander's business interests through threats of exposing his gambling addiction. The blackmail scheme extended to international figures as well. Sterling Tech had been selling illegally obtained intelligence to foreign governments and corporations, potentially compromising British national security. The evidence suggested that Alexander had been operating as an unofficial spy, selling his country's secrets to the highest bidder while maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman. Victoria Sterling's world continued to collapse as investigators revealed her complicity in several of her husband's schemes. Financial records showed that she had knowingly received proceeds from criminal activities, using dirty money to fund her extravagant lifestyle of designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive jewelry. Prosecutors began preparing charges against her for money laundering and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that Alexander's criminal activities had begun much earlier than anyone had suspected. Evidence dating back 15 years showed that he had been using illegal methods to gain competitive advantages for Sterling Tech since the company's early days. What the business world had seen as brilliant strategic thinking had actually been systematic criminal behavior. David Mitchell, the Royal Guard whose professional response to being assaulted had triggered this massive investigation, was struggling with the unexpected attention and responsibility that had been thrust upon him. Media outlets around the world wanted interviews with the man whose steadfast duty had brought down a criminal empire. However, military protocol prevented him from speaking publicly about the incident or the ongoing investigation. The impact on David's personal life was significant. His girlfriend Sarah, a primary school teacher, had been approached by tabloid reporters offering substantial sums for inside information about their relationship. The couple's privacy had been completely destroyed, and they were forced to change their phone numbers and avoid their usual social activities to escape the constant media attention. Alexander's children from his previous marriages were dealing with their own devastating consequences. Emma at Oxford found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from both fellow students and the media. Several of her friends distanced themselves from it, worried about being associated with the daughter of a suspected criminal. The psychological pressure became so intense that she began seeing a university counselor. Marcus, Alexander's younger son, had developed severe anxiety and depression as a result of the scandal. The teenager who had once been proud of his father's success was now ashamed to share the Sterling name. His mother, Alexander's first wife, was considering legally changing both their surnames to escape the stigma associated with the family. The financial devastation extended far beyond Alexander's immediate family. Thousands of Sterling Tech employees had lost their jobs when the company collapsed, and many had also lost their pension savings, which had been invested in company stock. Class action lawsuits were being prepared by groups of former employees seeking compensation for their losses, but investigation revealed that Alexander had been stealing from his own employees' pension fund to finance his criminal activities and lavish lifestyle. Over £200 million that should have protected workers' retirements had been diverted to offshore accounts and used for personal expenses. This betrayal of his employees' trust added another layer of criminality to his already extensive charges. Several of Alexander's business associates were arrested as the investigation expanded. His chief technology officer, who had helped design the illegal surveillance systems, was charged with conspiracy and computer crimes. The company's financial director faced charges for helping to structure the complex money laundering schemes that had hidden criminal proceeds. The government contract that had brought Alexander to Buckingham Palace became the subject of its own investigation. Parliamentary committees began examining how a criminal organization had been able to win sensitive security contracts through what appeared to be a combination of bribery, influence peddling, and fraudulent credentials. The revelations raised serious questions about government procurement processes. International law enforcement agencies began their own investigations as evidence emerged of Sterling Tech's activities in multiple countries. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation opened an inquiry into the company's operations in America, while European Union authorities examined potential violations of privacy laws and regulations regarding international data transfers. The scope of Alexander's surveillance network was staggering. The investigation revealed that Sterling Tech had been illegally monitoring hundreds of individuals across Europe and North America, collecting intimate details about their personal and professional lives. The sophisticated technology that Alexander had claimed was used only for legitimate security purposes had actually been deployed for criminal espionage on a massive scale. Alexander's mental state deteriorated significantly as the full extent of his exposure became clear. Prison medical staff placed him on suicide watch after he made several comments about ending his life rather than facing the consequences of his actions. The man who had once commanded respect and fear in the business world was now a broken figure facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The media coverage of the scandal dominated British news for weeks, with new revelations emerging daily about the scope of Alexander's criminal empire. Television documentaries, newspaper investigations, and online reporting competed to uncover additional details about how one of the country's most successful businessmen that had been secretly operating as a criminal mastermind. Victoria Sterling's attempts to distance herself from her husband's crimes were undermined by the mountain of evidence showing her active participation in money laundering. Prosecutors offered her a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation with the investigation, but she would still face several years in prison and the complete loss of her luxurious lifestyle. The revelation that Alexander had been secretly recording conversations with other prominent business people sent shockwaves through London's financial district. Corporate executives who had dealt with Sterling Tech began reviewing their interactions, worried about what compromising information might have been gathered and how it might be used against them or their companies. Several high-profile individuals who had been victims of Alexander's surveillance came forward with their own stories of suspected illegal monitoring. A prominent actress revealed that she had suspected her phones were being tapped during a contentious divorce proceeding. A business rival described receiving anonymous threats that could only have been based on illegally obtained private information. The case against Alexander continued to strengthen as investigators uncovered new evidence daily. The assault on the royal guard that had started the investigation was now just one small item in an indictment that included over 50 separate criminal charges. Legal experts predicted that if convicted on all charges, Alexander could face a prison sentence of over 30 years. David Mitchell had become an unwitting hero to many people, who saw his professional response to being assaulted as the catalyst that had exposed widespread corruption. However, the young royal guard struggled with the attention and responsibility that had been thrust upon him. All he had done was his duty, yet his actions had inadvertently brought down one of Britain's most powerful criminals. The investigation was still expanding, with new suspects being identified and additional criminal activities being uncovered regularly. What had begun as a moment of rage by an entitled businessman had revealed a criminal conspiracy that had operated at the highest levels of society for over a decade. Alexander Sterling's inability to control his temper for just one moment had ultimately exposed one of the largest criminal enterprises in British history. The confrontation reached its peak when Alexander Sterling completely lost control of his temper. After 20 minutes of increasingly heated arguments with Sergeant David Mitchell, the Billionaire CEO did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a moment of pure rage and entitlement, Alexander raised his hand and struck the royal guard across the face with an open palm, the sound echoing off the palace walls like a gunshot. The slap was witnessed by dozens of people, including other royal guards, palace staff, tourists, and his own wife Victoria, who gasped in horror at her husband's actions. The moment seemed to freeze in time as everyone processed what had just happened. A civilian had physically assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace, one of the most secure locations in the world. David Mitchell's training kicked in immediately. Despite the stinging pain across his cheek and the natural human instinct to retaliate, he remained at attention and did not strike back. His military discipline and years of training had prepared him for many scenarios, but being slapped by an angry businessman was certainly not one of them. The professionalism he displayed in that moment would later be praised by his superiors and the media. The response from other security personnel was swift and decisive. Within seconds, 3 additional royal guards had surrounded Alexander, while palace security officers moved to secure the area and begin crowd control. The businessman found himself facing the full force of royal protection protocols, as if he had just attempted to attack a member of the royal family themselves. Alexander seemed to realize immediately what he had done, but it was far too late to take it back. The shock on his face was evident as the gravity of his actions began to sink in. He had just committed assault against a royal guard on royal property, in full view of witnesses and security cameras. His moment of uncontrolled anger had potentially destroyed everything he had spent decades building. Victoria Sterling was mortified beyond description. As the wife of a prominent businessman, she was accustomed to attending high-profile events and maintaining proper decorum in public settings. The scene unfolding before her was her worst nightmare, made even worse by the fact that it was being recorded by multiple tourists and would undoubtedly end up on social media and in the news within hours. The immediate aftermath of the assault was chaotic but controlled. Palace security moved with military precision to secure the scene, separate witnesses, and begin preliminary documentation of the incident. Alexander was immediately detained and searched, while David was attended to by medical personnel who wanted to document any injuries for the official report. Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford of the Metropolitan Police was called to the scene within minutes, as the senior officer responsible for investigating crimes that occurred on royal property. She had dealt with various incidents over the years, but never anything quite like this. The assault of a royal guard by a prominent businessman would require careful handling due to the high profile, the nature of both the location and the perpetrator. The arrest itself was conducted with professional efficiency. Alexander Sterling, one of Britain's wealthiest individuals, was read his rights and handcuffed outside Buckingham Palace while tourists and media gathered to witness the spectacle. His Bentley and chauffeur waited nearby, a stark reminder of the privileged life he was potentially throwing away. During the arrest, Alexander alternated between arrogant defiance and desperate apologies. He demanded to speak to his lawyers, claimed the incident was being blown out of proportion, and at one point tried to offer financial compensation to David as if the assault could be resolved with money. His complete misunderstanding of the severity of his situation only made things worse. The news of the incident spread through London's financial district like wildfire. Within an hour of the assault, Sterling Tech's stock price began falling as investors reacted to reports that the company's CEO had been arrested for attacking a royal guard. The business media was already speculating about the potential impact on the company's government contracts and international reputation. Alexander's legal team, led by prominent solicitor Richard Hawthorne, was contacted immediately and rushed to the police station where their client was being held. Hawthorne had represented Alexander through various business disputes and regulatory issues, but criminal assault charges were entirely outside his usual area of expertise. He immediately began assembling a team that included criminal defense specialists. The interrogation at the police station revealed the full extent of Alexander's disconnection from reality regarding his situation. He seemed to believe that his wealth and business success would somehow mitigate the seriousness of assaulting a royal guard. When Detective Inspector Crawford explained the potential charges and consequences, Alexander's response was to threaten legal action against the police for treating him like a common criminal. Victoria Sterling faced her own crisis as news of the incident began spreading through London's social circles. Friends and acquaintances started calling and messaging, some offering support but others clearly enjoying the scandal surrounding one of the city's most prominent power couples. The humiliation was overwhelming, and Victoria began to realize that her luxurious lifestyle might be coming to an end. The media response was immediate and brutal. Within hours of the incident, news vans were stationed outside Sterling Tech headquarters, the family's Surrey estate, and the police station where Alexander was being held. Reporters were digging into every aspect of his business dealings, personal life, and previous controversies, looking for additional angles to the story. Sterling Tech's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the crisis and its potential impact on the company. Several major clients were already expressing concerns about continuing their relationships with a company whose CEO had been arrested for assault. The board faced difficult decisions about Alexander's continued leadership, role, and the company's future direction. The incident also had immediate consequences for the royal security protocols. An internal review was launched to examine how the situation had been allowed to escalate to the point of physical assault. While David Mitchell was praised for his professionalism and restraint, questions were raised about whether additional measures should have been taken to defuse the situation earlier. David Mitchell himself was dealing with the aftermath in his own way. As a career military professional, he had faced enemy fire and life-threatening situations with courage and composure. However, being assaulted by a civilian businessman in front of his colleagues and the public was a different kind of challenge that affected him more than he initially realized. The Royal Guard's family was also impacted by the incident. David's parents, who lived in a small town in Yorkshire, were shocked to see their son's name and face in national news reports. His younger sister, a university student, found herself fielding questions from classmates and professors about the incident involving her. Brother Alexander's children from his previous marriages learned about their father's arrest through social media and news reports, rather than from family members. His 19-year-old daughter Emma, studying at Oxford, was mortified when classmates began sharing videos and articles about the incident. His 16-year-old son Marcus, at an expensive private school, faced similar embarrassment among his peers. The legal implications of Alexander's actions were becoming clearer as the investigation progressed. Assault of a royal guard was taken extremely seriously by the British legal system, and the highly public nature of the incident made it then impossible for prosecutors to consider any kind of plea arrangement that might be seen as preferential treatment for a wealthy defendant. Alexander spent his first night in custody. The full weight of his actions began to sink in. The man who had controlled every aspect of his business empire and personal life for decades was now completely powerless, facing consequences that no amount of money or influence could prevent. His moment of uncontrolled rage had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything he had worked to achieve. The incident at Buckingham Palace was just the beginning of Alexander Sterling's downfall. The real consequences of his actions would unfold over the coming days and weeks, affecting not only his own life but the lives of everyone connected to him. The royal guard he had slapped would inadvertently become the instrument of justice that brought down one of Britain's most powerful businessmen. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Alexander Sterling's trial began at the Old Bailey, London's most famous criminal court. The proceedings had drawn international attention, with media outlets from around the world sending reporters to cover what was being called the trial of the decade. The man who had once commanded billion-pound business deals was now sitting in a defendant's dock, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution, led by Queen's Counsel Sir James Morrison, presented a devastating case that methodically documented Alexander's criminal empire. Over the course of 3 weeks, they revealed evidence of systematic fraud, tax evasion, illegal surveillance, blackmail, and conspiracy that painted a picture of a man who had built his fortune entirely through criminal means. The assault on Royal Guard David Mitchell was presented as merely the final act that had exposed years of hidden criminality. Alexander's defense team, despite being among the most expensive legal representation money could buy, struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence against their client. The prosecution had over 10,000 documents, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of witnesses who had been victims of Sterling Tech's illegal activities. The defense strategy appeared to focus on portraying Alexander as a brilliant businessman who had made some poor decisions, rather than a career criminal. David Mitchell took the stand as the prosecution's first witness, describing the events at Buckingham Palace with military precision and professionalism. His testimony was compelling not just because of the assault he had suffered, but because it demonstrated the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized Alexander's approach to authority and the law throughout his criminal career. During cross-examination, Alexander's defense attorneys attempted to portray the royal guard as having provoked the assault through excessive enforcement of security protocols. However, David's calm, professional responses and the testimony of multiple witnesses who had observed his exemplary conduct during the confrontation made this strategy ineffective. If anything, the defense's attacks on David seemed to anger the jury and strengthen the prosecution's case. Victoria Sterling had accepted a plea agreement and testified against her husband in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed intimate details about Alexander's criminal activities, including his practice of bragging about illegal surveillance operations and discussing blackmail schemes during private conversations. The woman who had once been Alexander's closest confidant became one of the most damaging witnesses against him. The courtroom was packed daily with former Sterling Tech employees, victims of the surveillance operations, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served. Many of the employees who had lost their jobs and pensions when the company collapsed attended every day of the trial, hoping to see their former boss held accountable for destroying their livelihoods. Alexander's appearance had changed dramatically during his months in custody. The confident, well-dressed businessman had been replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of months. Prison life and the stress of facing multiple criminal charges had taken a visible toll on his physical and mental health, making him almost unrecognizable from the powerful executive he had once been. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from several high-profile individuals who had been victims of Alexander's blackmail schemes. A former cabinet minister described how Alexander had used compromising photographs to extract both money and political influence. A high court judge testified about being pressured to rule in favor of Sterling Tech through threats to expose his personal problems. International witnesses testified via video link about Sterling Tech's activities in their countries. American executives described how the company had stolen trade secrets through illegal surveillance. European officials detailed how sensitive government information had been compromised by Alexander's espionage network. The scope of his criminal empire was truly international in its reach and impact on Emma Sterling, Alexander's daughter, made the difficult decision to testify against her father. The Oxford student described growing up with luxury that she now realized had been funded by criminal activities. Her testimony was particularly powerful when she spoke about discovering that her father had been illegally surveilling her friends' families to gather intelligence that could be used for business advantage. Marcus, Alexander's youngest son, was too traumatized to testify in person, but his written statement was read to the court. The 16-year-old described the psychological damage caused by learning that his father was a criminal, expressing feelings of betrayal and shame that had led to severe depression and anxiety requiring ongoing psychiatric treatment. The financial evidence presented by prosecutors was staggering in its complexity and scope. Forensic accountants testified about discovering over 300 offshore accounts and shell companies that Alexander had used to hide criminal proceeds and evade taxes. The sophisticated money laundering operation had moved over £2 billion through international banking systems over the course of 15 years. One of the most damaging aspects of the prosecution's case was the evidence showing how Alexander had systematically betrayed the trust of his own employees. The theft of pension funds was particularly heinous, as it had robbed thousands of working people of their retirement security to fund Alexander's criminal activities and lavish lifestyle. Many former employees wept openly in the courtroom as the details of this betrayal were revealed. The defense team's attempts to humanize Alexander fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence of his callous disregard for others. Character witnesses who had known him in his early business days testified about his intelligence and drive, but these positive traits only served to emphasize how deliberately and methodically he had chosen to pursue criminal activities rather than legitimate business success. Alexander's decision to testify on his own behalf proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Under questioning from his own attorneys, he came across as arrogant and unrepentant, showing little genuine remorse for the lives he had destroyed. When Sir James Morrison cross-examined him, Alexander's answers revealed a man who still believed he was above the law and that his wealth and intelligence justified his criminal behavior. During one particularly devastating exchange, Alexander was confronted with recordings of him laughing about the stupid people who trusted him with their pension savings while he was stealing their money. His attempt to explain these comments as taken out of context only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a remorseless predator who had viewed his victims with contempt. The trial revealed that Alexander's assault on David Mitchell had not been an isolated incident of lost temper, but part of a pattern of believing that his wealth exempted him from normal rules and consequences. Multiple witnesses testified about previous incidents where Alexander had become violent or threatening when faced with authority figures who wouldn't bend to his will. Expert witnesses explained to the jury how Alexander's surveillance technology had been used to violate the privacy of hundreds of individuals. The sophisticated systems that Sterling Tech had developed for legitimate security purposes had been perverted into tools for criminal espionage, corporate theft, and personal blackmail. The technical evidence demonstrated the premeditated and systematic nature of his crimes. The international scope of Alexander's criminal activities became clear through testimony from law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Interpol agents described how Sterling Tech had been selling British intelligence secrets to foreign governments, potentially compromising national security in ways that might never be fully understood. The espionage charges carried some of the most severe penalties Alexander faced. As the trial progressed, additional victims came forward with stories of how Alexander's criminal activities had destroyed their lives. A small business owner described how Sterling Tech had stolen his company's trade secrets, leading to bankruptcy and the loss of jobs for dozens of employees. A politician's wife testified about the psychological trauma caused by discovering that her private conversations had been recorded and used for blackmail. The courtroom drama intensified when prosecutors revealed that Alexander had continued to attempt criminal activities even while in custody awaiting trial. Recorded phone conversations showed him trying to intimidate witnesses and attempting to access hidden offshore accounts to fund his legal defense. These actions added additional charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice to his already lengthy indictment. David Mitchell's commanding officers testified about the exceptional professionalism he had shown during and after the assault. Military witnesses described his restraint in not retaliating against Alexander's attack and his continued dedication to duty despite the traumatic experience. The contrast between the Royal Guard's honor and Alexander's criminality could not have been starker. The prosecution's closing argument painted a comprehensive picture of Alexander Sterling as a man who had spent 15 years systematically betraying every trust placed in him. Sir James Morrison argued that Alexander's wealth and success had been built entirely on criminal foundations and that his assault on a royal guard was simply the final act of arrogance that had exposed his true nature to the world. Alexander's defense team made a desperate final plea for leniency, arguing that their client had made mistakes but didn't deserve to spend the rest of his life in prison. However, their arguments rang hollow in the face of evidence showing the deliberate, calculated nature of Alexander's crimes and the devastating impact they had had on hundreds of victims. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 53 charges against Alexander Sterling. The forewoman read each verdict with firm conviction, and Alexander's face showed no emotion as his fate was sealed. The man who had once controlled a billion-pound empire had been unanimously convicted of building that empire through criminal means, As the verdicts were read, many of the victims present in the courtroom openly wept with relief and satisfaction. Justice was finally being served for the man who had destroyed so many lives through his greed and arrogance. David Mitchell, sitting in the public gallery, maintained his characteristic composure, but those who knew him could see the satisfaction in his eyes. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving the judge time to consider the appropriate punishment for crimes that had affected thousands of victims and potentially compromised national security. Legal experts predicted that Alexander would receive one of the longest prison sentences in British court rate crime history. Victoria Sterling, who had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the money laundering scheme, watched from the public gallery as her husband's conviction was announced. The woman who had once lived in luxury was now facing her own prison term, and the couple's fairy tale life of wealth and privilege had become a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of criminal greed. The sentencing hearing for Alexander Sterling drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Victims of his crimes, former employees, and members of the public packed the Old Bailey courtroom to witness the final chapter in one of Britain's most spectacular criminal cases. Judge Sir William Harrison, known for his firm approach to white-collar crime, had spent a week reviewing victim impact statements and legal precedents before determining Alexander's fate. The victim impact statements were read aloud, creating a devastating portrait of the human cost of Alexander's criminal empire. A retired Sterling tech employee described losing his entire pension savings and being forced to work as a security guard at age 70 to pay for basic necessities. A businesswoman whose company had been destroyed by Sterling Tech's corporate espionage spoke about the suicide attempt that followed her bankruptcy and the loss of everything she had worked to build. David Mitchell, the royal guard whose assault had triggered the entire investigation, submitted a statement that was read by the prosecutor. In measured professional language, he described the impact of being physically attacked while performing his duty, but emphasized that he was grateful his experience had led to justice for Alexander's many victims. His words carried particular weight because of the dignity and restraint he had shown throughout the ordeal. Emma Sterling, now estranged from her father, provided one of the most powerful victim impact statements. The Oxford student described the psychological trauma of learning that her privileged upbringing had been funded by criminal activities and the ongoing therapy she required to cope with the betrayal of trust by the man she had once idolized. Her statement brought many observers to tears as she spoke about losing not just her father, but her faith in the fundamental decency of people. Marcus Sterling's statement, read by his mother, revealed the devastating impact the scandal had had on a teenager who had gone from being proud of his successful father to being ashamed to carry the family name. The boy had attempted suicide twice since his father's arrest, and child psychologists had testified that the trauma might affect him for the rest of his life. The prosecution requested a sentence of 35 years in prison, arguing that Alexander's crimes represented one of the most comprehensive betrayals of public trust in British legal history. They emphasized that his criminal activities had spanned 15 years, affected thousands of victims, and potentially compromised national security through the sale of intelligence to foreign governments. Alexander's defense team made a final plea for mercy, arguing that their client was a broken man who had already lost everything and posed no future threat to society. They requested a sentence of 15 years, claiming that Alexander's age and deteriorated health meant that a longer sentence would effectively be a death penalty. The defense also pointed to character references from Alexander's early business associates, though these carried little weight given the overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior. Judge Sir William Harrison's sentencing remarks were comprehensive and scathing. He described Alexander's crimes as representing the most systematic and callous abuse of trust he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The judge noted that Alexander had shown no genuine remorse throughout the trial and had continued to attempt criminal activities even while in custody awaiting sentencing. Judge sentenced Alexander Sterling to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years before he could be considered for parole. At 53 years old, this meant Alexander would be at least 81 before he could even apply for release, making it likely that he would die in prison. The sentence was one of the longest ever imposed for white-collar crime in British history. The courtroom erupted in applause from victims and their families as the sentence was announced. Many of the former Sterling Tech employees who had lost their pensions and livelihoods wept with relief that their former boss had finally been held accountable for his crimes. Alexander showed no visible emotion as his fate was sealed, staring straight ahead with a hollow expression that had characterized his appearance throughout the trial. Victoria Sterling, who had been present for the sentencing, collapsed in tears as she realized that her husband would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The woman who had once lived in unimaginable luxury was now facing her own prison sentence and the complete destruction of everything she had known. Their fairy tale marriage had become a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of criminal greed. The international implications of Alexander's crimes continued to unfold long after his sentencing. Several foreign governments had initiated extradition proceedings, seeking to prosecute him for espionage activities conducted in their territories. However, British authorities indicated that Alexander would serve his domestic sentence first, meaning any international prosecution would have to wait decades. The Sterling Tech criminal investigation led to a comprehensive reform of government contracting procedures and security clearance protocols. Parliamentary committees recommended new safeguards to prevent criminal organizations from obtaining sensitive government contracts, and several officials responsible for approving Alexander's security clearances faced disciplinary action for their failures. David Mitchell was promoted to sergeant major and received a commendation for his exemplary conduct during the assault incident and subsequent investigation. However, the young soldier struggled with the unwanted celebrity status that had resulted from his role in exposing Alexander's crimes. He requested a transfer to a less public position within the Royal Guard, seeking to return to the anonymous service that had attracted him to the military. The civil lawsuits against Alexander's estate continued for years after his criminal conviction. Thousands of victims sought compensation for their losses, though the complex process of recovering and distributing Alexander's hidden assets meant that most would receive only a fraction of what they had lost. The offshore accounts and shell companies that Alexander had used to hide his criminal proceeds proved difficult to access. Despite court orders requiring their disclosure, Emma Sterling changed her surname and eventually graduated from Oxford with honors. Despite the ongoing challenges of being associated with one of Britain's most notorious criminals, she became an advocate for white-collar crime victims and established a charity to help people who had lost their pensions and savings to corporate fraud. Her work provided a small measure of redemption for the Sterling family name. Marcus Sterling required years of intensive therapy to recover from the trauma of his father's crimes and the public humiliation that followed. He eventually found stability with his mother and stepfather, who legally adopted him and provided the loving family environment he needed to heal. The teenager who had once been proud of his wealthy father learned to take pride in overcoming the challenges that Alexander's criminality had created. The investigation into Sterling Tech's criminal activities continued for several more years, as prosecutors worked to identify and prosecute other individuals who had participated in Alexander's schemes. Several former employees received prison sentences for their roles in the surveillance and blackmail operations. Though none faced penalties as severe as Alexander's life sentence, the case became a landmark in British criminal law, establishing important precedents for prosecuting complex white-collar crimes and corporate espionage. Law schools around the world studied the Sterling case as an example of how seemingly legitimate businesses could be used to hide extensive criminal operations, and how a moment of uncontrolled anger could trigger the exposure of years of hidden criminality. Alexander's assault on Royal Guard David Mitchell had lasted only seconds, but its consequences continued to reverberate years later. The slap that had seemed like a minor incident of bad temper had ultimately exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in British history and led to justice for thousands of victims who might otherwise never have received it. In the end, Alexander Sterling's moment of rage at being treated like an ordinary citizen rather than a privileged elite had revealed the truth about his character and his crimes. The man who had built his fortune by betraying every trust placed in him had been brought down by his own arrogance and inability to accept that the law applied to him just like everyone else. His life sentence served as a powerful reminder that wealth and power cannot ultimately protect those who choose to live outside the boundaries of law and decency. The Royal Guard, who had maintained his professional composure while being assaulted by one of Britain's wealthiest men, had inadvertently triggered one of the most important criminal investigations in the country's history. David Mitchell's commitment to duty and dignity in the face of Alexander's attack had not only protected the honor of his position, but had also served justice for thousands of victims who deserved to see their tormentor held accountable for his crimes.